The sound of high heels clicking against the airport floor echoed through Terminal C as Rebecca hurried toward her gate. Her phone showed 6:35 p.m., and her flight to Seattle was scheduled to depart in just 10 minutes. The board meeting had gone way longer than expected, stretching into the evening hours when it should have wrapped up by lunch. Rebecca owned a tech company that specialized in security software, and today's meeting with potential investors had been crucial. She'd spent months preparing for this presentation, knowing that landing this deal could change everything for her small but growing business. The meeting had gone well, but the endless questions and negotiations had eaten up her entire day. Now she was practically running through the airport, her laptop bag bouncing against her hip with each hurried step. The Denver International Airport was busier than usual for a Tuesday evening, with delayed flights backing up passengers throughout the terminal. Rebecca weaved between families dragging suitcases and business travelers typing frantically on their phones. When she finally reached Gate B12, most passengers had already boarded. The gate agent, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired smile, looked up from her computer screen as Rebecca approached the counter. "Cutting it close tonight," the agent said with a small laugh as she took Rebecca's boarding pass. "Let me scan this for you." Rebecca caught her breath while waiting, glancing at the few remaining passengers in the gate area. A couple was arguing quietly about missing their connection, and an elderly man sat reading a newspaper, seemingly unbothered by the chaos around him. The scanner beeped, but instead of the usual green light, it flashed red. The gate agent frowned and tried scanning the boarding pass again. "Same result. That's strange," the agent said, squinting at her computer screen. "I'm showing seat 2A is already occupied. Are you sure this is your correct boarding pass?" Rebecca felt her stomach drop. After the long day she'd had, the last thing she needed was a seating problem. "Yes, I'm certain. I specifically requested that seat when I booked the flight 3 weeks ago." The gate agent typed something into her computer, her frown deepening. "Well, this is unusual. Let me call the flight crew and see what's going on. Sometimes we have duplicate seat assignments when there are last-minute changes." Rebecca glanced at her watch. The boarding door would close any minute, and she absolutely had to be in Seattle by 9 p.m. for a dinner meeting with a client. Missing this flight wasn't an option. "Can you just assign me a different seat?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice. "I'm afraid first class is completely full tonight," the agent replied, still typing. "Let me see what the crew says about your original seat." After what felt like forever but was probably only 2 minutes, the agent hung up her phone. "Okay, they want you to board and speak with the lead flight attendant. She'll sort this out once you're on the plane." Rebecca thanked her and hurried down the jet bridge, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe someone had been upgraded to her seat by mistake. Maybe there was a computer glitch. Either way, she needed to get this resolved quickly. The airplane felt warm and crowded as she stepped inside. Most passengers were already settled in their seats, stowing bags and getting comfortable for the 2-hour flight. Rebecca made her way toward the front of the plane, where first class was located. Seat 2A was in the second row, right side, with extra legroom and a wide, comfortable-looking chair. But someone was already sitting there. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17 years old, sat curled up in her seat with his knees pulled up toward his chest. He wore a dark blue hoodie that looked like it had seen better days, and he clutched a worn black backpack against his body like it contained something precious. What struck Rebecca most was the look in his eyes. Even from a few feet away, she could see they were red and puffy like he'd been crying. He stared straight ahead, not making eye contact with anyone, but there was something about his posture that suggested fear rather than sadness. Rebecca approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. She dealt with enough difficult situations in business to know that how you start a conversation often determines how it ends. "Excuse me," she said gently, keeping her voice low so other passengers wouldn't stare. "I think there might be some confusion about the seating. This is supposed to be my seat." The boy looked up at her, and Rebecca was struck by how young he appeared. His face was thin, and he had the kind of exhausted look that comes from traveling for hours. But it was the fear in his eyes that caught her attention most. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of passengers settling in around them. "I know I'm not supposed to be here, but I can't go back there." He nodded toward the back of the plane without turning around. "There are these men, and they keep watching me. Rebecca followed his gaze toward the rear of the aircraft. She couldn't see much from where she stood, but something in the boy's voice made her take his concern seriously. In her years running a business, she'd learned to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct she had was telling her that this kid was genuinely scared. "What men?" she asked, sitting down in the aisle seat next to him so they could talk more privately. The boy glanced around nervously before answering. "They got on the plane in Phoenix, same as me. During the layover, I noticed them watching me. One of them even went up to the gate agent and asked questions about unaccompanied minors on the flight." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard enough news stories to know that teenage travelers could be vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. But she also knew that airplane seating wasn't something you could just ignore. "What's your name?" she asked. "Danny," he replied, still clutching his backpack. "Danny Rodriguez. I'm supposed to be in seat 34F, but when I walked back there to find my seat, I saw those two men sitting right across the aisle. They looked at me like they knew exactly who I was." Just then, a flight attendant approached them. She was a woman in her 30s with blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun and a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening," the flight attendant said, addressing both Rebecca and Danny. "I understand we have a seating situation here. Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass so we can get this sorted out." Danny's grip on his backpack tightened, and Rebecca could see his hands shaking slightly. Whatever was going on, this kid was terrified of something, and Rebecca's protective instincts were kicking in. She thought about her own nephew, who was about the same age as Danny. If he were traveling alone and scared, she'd want someone to help him. Sometimes being successful in business meant making quick decisions based on limited information, and right now, her gut was telling her that Danny needed help more than she needed a first-class seat. "Actually," Rebecca said, looking up at the flight attendant, "I think we can solve this pretty easily." The flight attendant's professional smile remained fixed in place, but Rebecca could see a hint of impatience creeping into her eyes. The plane was fully boarded now, and they needed to resolve this seating issue before takeoff. "I'm listening," the flight attendant said, her name tag reading Jessica. "How exactly do you propose we solve this?" Rebecca looked at Danny, who was still holding his backpack like a shield. The fear in his eyes hadn't diminished, and she could see him glancing nervously toward the back of the plane every few seconds. "He can keep this seat," Rebecca said simply. "I'll take his seat in the back." Jessica blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, are you sure? You paid for a first-class ticket. His seat is in the very last row of the aircraft." "I'm sure," Rebecca replied, though she had to admit the thought of spending 2 hours crammed into a middle seat in the back wasn't appealing. But something about Danny's situation felt serious, and her business instincts were telling her to pay attention. Jessica looked between them, clearly trying to understand what was happening. "Sir, I still need to see your boarding pass to verify your ticket and make sure everything is legitimate." Danny fumbled through his backpack with trembling hands, finally pulling out a crumpled boarding pass. As he handed it to Jessica, Rebecca caught sight of the details. The ticket was indeed for seat 34F, and the name on it read, D. Rodriguez, unaccompanied minor. "You're traveling alone?" Rebecca asked gently. Danny nodded. "My aunt lives in Seattle. I'm supposed to stay with her for a while." He paused, then added quietly, "My dad died last month." Rebecca felt her heart clench. No wonder the kid looked scared and exhausted. Losing a parent and then having to travel across the country alone would be terrifying for anyone, let alone a teenager. Jessica examined the boarding pass carefully. "Everything appears to be in order," she said. "But I have to ask, why exactly are you afraid to sit in your assigned seat?" Danny looked at Rebecca as if asking for permission to explain. She gave him an encouraging nod. "There are 2 men sitting near my seat," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been following me since Phoenix. During my layover, I went to get food, and they were always somewhere nearby. Then when I went to the bathroom, one of them was standing right outside when I came out." "That could be a coincidence," Jessica said, though her expression was becoming more concerned. "Maybe," Danny replied. "But then at the gate, I heard one of them talking to the agent about unaccompanied minors. He asked her how many were on the flight and what the policy was for checking on them during the flight." Rebecca felt another chill run down her spine. That definitely didn't sound like a coincidence. "Did you tell anyone about this?" Rebecca asked. "Airport security?" "Your aunt," Danny shook his head. I tried calling my aunt, but her phone went straight to voicemail, and I didn't know what to tell security. I mean, they haven't actually done anything wrong. They're just watching me. Jessica was looking more troubled by the minute. Can you describe these men? One is tall with dark hair and a beard. He's wearing a gray jacket. The other one is shorter and bald, wearing a black shirt. They both look like they're in their 30s, maybe 40s. Rebecca had spent years in the business world, dealing with all kinds of people and situations. She'd learned to read body language and trust her instincts when something felt off. Everything about Danny's story sounded genuine, and the fear in his voice was real. Jessica, Rebecca said, what if we're wrong, and there really is something to worry about? What's the harm in letting him stay here while I sit in the back, if nothing else? It gives us a chance to observe these men and see if their behavior really is suspicious. Jessica looked torn between following standard procedure and addressing what might be a legitimate safety concern. I suppose, if you're willing to switch seats voluntarily, there's no rule against it. But I think I should mention this to the captain. That sounds like a good idea, Rebecca agreed. Jessica turned to Danny. Honey, I want you to stay right here while I talk to the captain and my crew. Don't leave this seat for any reason, okay? Danny nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that adults were taking his concerns seriously. As Jessica walked toward the cockpit, Rebecca settled into the aisle seat next to Danny. So tell me more about what happened in Phoenix. Danny took a shaky breath. I was connecting from Tucson, where I lived with my dad. The flight was delayed, so I had about 3 hours to wait. I found a quiet spot near my gate and was just reading a book, trying to keep to myself. That's when you first noticed these men? Yeah. At first I thought it was just random, you know. Airports are crowded, people walk around. But then I realized they were always positioned where they could see me. When I moved to a different area, one of them would move too. Rebecca nodded, encouraging him to continue. The worst part was when I went to get dinner. I was in line at this sandwich place, and the shorter guy got in line right behind me. He started asking me questions like where I was traveling to and if I was traveling alone. I lied and said my mom was waiting for me at the gate. Smart thinking, Rebecca said. What did he say to that? He just smiled and said that was nice. But then he asked what gate my flight was leaving from. I realized I had my boarding pass sticking out of my pocket, and he could probably see the gate number anyway. Rebecca was becoming more convinced that Danny's fears were justified. The men's behavior sounded deliberate and predatory. Danny, can I ask you something? Is there any reason why someone might want to follow you specifically? I mean, beyond just the fact that you're a teenager traveling alone? Danny hesitated, then looked down at his backpack. Maybe my dad. Before he died, he gave me some things to take to my aunt. He said they were important and that I shouldn't let anyone else see them. What kind of things? Just some computer stuff. Flash drives and papers. My dad worked with computers and he said my aunt would know what to do with them. Rebecca felt pieces of a puzzle starting to come together, though she couldn't see the full picture yet. A teenager traveling alone with computer equipment his deceased father had given him, being followed by suspicious men who seemed to know he was an unaccompanied minor. Jessica returned from the cockpit, looking serious. I spoke with Captain Morrison, and he wants to be notified immediately if there are any further concerns. For now, we're going to proceed with the seat switch as requested. She turned to Rebecca. Ma'am, are you absolutely certain you want to give up your first-class seat? Rebecca looked at Danny, who was watching her with a mixture of hope and gratitude in his young eyes. She thought about her own comfortable life, her successful business, and the fact that she could afford to fly first class whenever she wanted. This kid had lost his father, was traveling alone to live with relatives, and was scared for his safety. I'm certain, she said firmly. Jessica made some notes on her clipboard. All right then. Ma'am, your new seat assignment is 34F, sir. You'll remain in 2A. As Jessica walked away to finish her pre-flight preparations, Danny turned to Rebecca with tears in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered. I know you don't even know me, but thank you for believing me. Rebecca reached over and patted his shoulder gently. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people. And my instincts tell me you're a good kid who's been through enough already. As she gathered her belongings to move to the back of the plane, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be anything but routine. Something told her that switching seats was just the beginning of what was going to be a very eventful evening. Rebecca made her way down the narrow aisle toward the back of the plane, her small carry-on bag in one hand and her purse in the other. The aircraft was completely full, and she had to squeeze past passengers who were still settling in and organizing their belongings in the overhead bins. As she walked, she found herself scanning the faces of the other travelers, wondering which ones might be the men Danny had described. Most passengers looked like typical business travelers or families heading home, but Rebecca had learned in her years running a company that dangerous people often looked completely ordinary. Row 34 was indeed the very last row of the aircraft, right in front of the bathrooms. The seats were noticeably smaller than her first-class accommodations, and there was barely any legroom. But what caught Rebecca's attention immediately weren't the cramped conditions. It was the two men sitting in seats 34D and 34E, right across the aisle from where she was supposed to sit. The first man matched Danny's description perfectly. He was tall with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a gray jacket over a black shirt. The second man was shorter and completely bald, dressed in a dark blue button-down shirt. Both appeared to be in their 30s or early 40s, and both looked up with obvious surprise when Rebecca appeared instead of Danny. "Excuse me," Rebecca said politely, pointing to seat 34F. "I believe this is my seat." The tall man with the beard looked confused. "I thought there was supposed to be a kid sitting there." A teenager. Rebecca felt her blood run cold. How would this man know who was supposed to be sitting in a specific seat, unless he'd been paying very close attention to the passenger manifest? "Change of plans," Rebecca replied as casually as she could manage, sliding into the window seat. He got moved to a different part of the plane. The two men exchanged a quick glance that confirmed every one of Danny's suspicions. These men had definitely been expecting to sit near him, and they weren't happy about the change in seating arrangements. Rebecca pulled out her phone and pretended to check her messages while actually opening the camera app. She needed to document these men's faces just in case Danny's fears turned out to be justified. Pretending to take a selfie, she managed to capture both men in the background of her photos. The shorter bald man leaned forward slightly. "Do you happen to know which part of the plane the kid moved to?" Warning bells went off in Rebecca's head. There was no innocent reason for a stranger to be asking about a teenager's location on an airplane. "I'm not really sure," Rebecca lied smoothly. "I think the flight attendant just found him a different seat somewhere." The tall man pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Rebecca noticed that he seemed to be sending text messages, despite the fact that they hadn't taken off yet and the flight attendants hadn't announced that electronic devices were permitted. Rebecca studied the men more carefully while pretending to read emails on her own phone. Both had the kind of alert, watchful demeanor she associated with security personnel or law enforcement, but something about their behavior suggested they weren't the good guys. They kept glancing toward the front of the plane and whispering to each other in voices too low for her to hear. The tall man finished typing on his phone and put it away, then stood up and walked toward the front of the aircraft. Rebecca watched him go, noting that he moved with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations. While he was gone, Rebecca decided to take a risk. She turned to the shorter man and smiled pleasantly. "Business trip?" she asked, as if making casual conversation. "Something like that," he replied, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "What about you?" "Just heading home to Seattle. Long day at work." Rebecca kept her tone light and friendly. "Are you from Seattle originally?" "No, just visiting." The man's answers were short and gave away nothing useful. The tall man returned a few minutes later, and Rebecca could tell from his expression that he wasn't happy. He sat down heavily and immediately began whispering urgently to his companion. Rebecca couldn't make out the words, but she caught a few fragments. "Moved him. First class. Need to." Rebecca felt her heart rate increase. These men were definitely not random passengers who just happened to be sitting near Danny's assigned seat. They had been specifically positioned to watch him, and now they were trying to figure out how to locate him in his new seat. She thought about Danny sitting up in first class, probably feeling safe for the first time since Phoenix. The boy was clearly carrying something that these men wanted, and Rebecca was becoming more convinced that his father's death might not have been the accident Danny believed it to be. The plane began to taxi away from the gate, and the flight attendants started their safety demonstration. Rebecca used the distraction to send a quick text message to her assistant, asking her to research any recent news stories about computer technicians or tech workers dying in suspicious circumstances in the Tucson area. As the safety demonstration continued, Rebecca noticed the tall man get up again and walk toward the bathroom. But instead of going inside, he lingered in the area near the galley, clearly trying to get a better view of the first-class section where Danny was sitting. When he returned to his seat, he looked frustrated. He pulled out his phone again and began typing another message. Rebecca wondered who he was communicating with, and whether there might be other people involved in whatever this was. The bald man leaned over and whispered something to his companion, and Rebecca caught the words, after we land, Rebecca, backup plan. That confirmed her worst fears. These men weren't just watching Danny, they were planning to do something when the plane landed in Seattle. Rebecca realized that switching seats might have bought Danny some temporary safety, but it hadn't solved the underlying problem. She thought about the items Danny was carrying in his backpack. Computer equipment and papers that his father had given him before dying. If his father had been involved in something dangerous enough to get him killed, then Danny was carrying evidence that could put these men in serious trouble. Rebecca had built her business by being decisive in crisis situations, and she could see that this was rapidly becoming a crisis. Danny was just a scared teenager who had no idea what he was really carrying or how much danger he was in. And now by helping him, Rebecca had made herself a target as well. The plane finished taxiing and began its takeoff roll. As they lifted off from Denver, Rebecca made a decision that would change the course of the entire flight. She couldn't just sit back and hope that everything would work out once they landed in Seattle. She needed to take action. She pressed the call button above her seat and waited for a flight attendant to respond. When Jessica appeared a few minutes later, Rebecca stood up and asked if she could speak with her privately in the galley area. "What can I help you with?" Jessica asked once they were out of earshot of the other passengers. Rebecca took a deep breath. "I think that boy Danny is in serious danger. And I think these two men sitting next to me are the reason why." Jessica's expression became more serious. "What makes you say that?" Rebecca quickly explained what she had observed. The men's knowledge of Danny's seating assignment, their questions about his location, their text messages, and obvious frustration when they realized he had moved. She also shared her suspicions about the items Danny was carrying and the possibility that his father's death hadn't been accidental. Jessica listened carefully, asking a few clarifying questions. When Rebecca finished, the flight attendant looked troubled. "This is definitely something the captain needs to know about," Jessica said. "Will you wait here while I go speak with him?" Rebecca nodded, glancing back toward her seat where the two men were now both on their phones typing furiously. Whatever they were planning, it was clear that time was running out. As Jessica disappeared into the cockpit, Rebecca realized that what had started as a simple business trip was turning into something much more complicated and dangerous. But there was no turning back now. Danny needed help, and she was in a position to provide it. She just hoped they would be able to figure out a solution before the plane landed in Seattle and these men had a chance to put their plan into action. Jessica emerged from the cockpit after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes. Her expression was grave, and Rebecca could tell that Captain Morrison was taking the situation seriously. "The captain wants to speak with you directly," Jessica said in a low voice. "Can you come with me?" Rebecca followed Jessica to the front of the plane, past the first-class section where Danny was sitting. She caught his eye as they walked by, and she could see the worry on his face. He clearly sensed that something significant was happening. The cockpit was smaller than Rebecca had expected, filled with instruments and displays that looked incredibly complex. Captain Morrison was a man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably came from decades of handling emergency situations. "Ma'am, Jessica has filled me in on your concerns," Captain Morrison said, turning in his seat to face her. "I need you to tell me exactly what you've observed, and I want you to be as specific as possible." Rebecca took a deep breath and recounted everything she had witnessed. The men's surprise when she appeared instead of Danny, their knowledge of his seating assignment, their questions about his location, and their obvious frustration when they realized he had moved. She also shared what Danny had told her about being followed in Phoenix and the suspicious conversation one of the men had with the gate agent about unaccompanied. Minors, and you believe this boy is carrying something that these men want? Captain Morrison asked. Yes. His father died recently, and before his death, he gave Danny some computer equipment and documents to take to his aunt in Seattle. Danny said his father told him they were important and that he shouldn't let anyone else see them. Captain Morrison exchanged a look with his co-pilot, a younger woman who had been listening intently to the conversation. Captain, the co-pilot said, if this boy is carrying evidence of criminal activity, and these men are planning to intercept him in Seattle, shouldn't we contact authorities on the ground? That's exactly what I'm thinking, Captain Morrison replied. He turned back to Rebecca. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I want you to go back to your seat and continue observing these men. Document anything suspicious you see, but don't let them know you're watching them. Can you do that? Rebecca nodded. What are you going to do? I'm going to contact air traffic control and request assistance from federal authorities. If what you're telling me is accurate, we may need to have law enforcement waiting when we land in Seattle. As Rebecca made her way back to her seat, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the captain was taking action, but apprehension about what these men might do if they realized their plan was being discovered. The two men looked up as she returned to seat 34F. The tall man with the beard seemed more agitated than before, constantly checking his phone and shifting in his seat. The shorter bald man appeared calmer, but Rebecca noticed that his eyes were constantly scanning the cabin, as if he was looking for potential threats or escape routes. 20 minutes into the flight, as they reached cruising altitude, Rebecca observed the bald man pull out his phone again. This time, instead of just typing text messages, he appeared to be using some kind of messaging app that worked without the airplane's Wi-Fi. Rebecca knew that some phones could connect to satellite networks for emergency communications, but it was expensive and typically used only by people who had special authorization. The fact that these men had that kind of technology suggested they were part of a larger, more sophisticated operation than Rebecca had initially realized. She watched as the man typed a long message, pausing occasionally to look around the cabin before continuing. When he finished, he showed the phone to his companion, who read the message and nodded grimly. Rebecca wished she could see what they were writing, but she didn't dare lean over far enough to read the screen. Instead, she continued pretending to work on her own phone while keeping them in her peripheral vision. The tall man stood up again and walked toward the front of the plane. This time, Rebecca was sure he wasn't heading to the bathroom. He moved slowly down the aisle, looking carefully at each passenger as he passed. When he reached the first-class section, he lingered for a moment, clearly trying to spot Danny. Rebecca held her breath, hoping that Danny would have the sense to keep his head down and avoid drawing attention to himself. After a few moments, the man continued to the front galley area, where he struck up a conversation with one of the flight attendants. From her position in the back, Rebecca couldn't hear what they were talking about, but she could see the flight attendant shaking her head and pointing back toward the rear of the plane. The man persisted, apparently asking questions, but the flight attendant maintained her professional smile while clearly declining to provide whatever information he was seeking. When the man returned to his seat, he looked frustrated and angry. He immediately began typing another message on his phone, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. That's when Rebecca heard the announcement that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. We've received information that requires us to return to Denver as a precautionary measure. We're going to begin our descent shortly, and we should be on the ground in approximately 30 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for an early arrival. The reaction from the two men was immediate and dramatic. The tall man stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. What do you mean we're going back to Denver? He demanded, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. I have important business in Seattle. The bald man grabbed his companion's arm and pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently. But Rebecca could see that both men were now visibly agitated, their calm professionalism completely abandoned. Other passengers began murmuring among themselves, confused and annoyed by the unexpected change in plans. A businessman across the aisle complained loudly about missing his connection, while a woman with 2 small children looked worried about their hotel reservations. But Rebecca's attention was focused entirely on the 2 men next to her. The bald man was now making phone calls, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. She caught fragments of his conversation. Compromise. Bort. Alternative plans. The tall man, meanwhile, was typing frantically on his phone, his agitation growing more obvious by the minute. At one point, he stood up again and walked toward the bathroom. But Rebecca noticed that he lingered in the galley area, clearly trying to overhear conversations between the flight attendants. When he returned, both men began gathering their belongings, checking their carry-on bags and ensuring their phones were easily accessible. Their behavior suggested they were preparing for some kind of confrontation or escape scenario. Rebecca realized that by reporting her suspicions to the captain, she had essentially trapped these men on an airplane that was now heading back to Denver, where federal authorities would presumably be waiting. She had no idea how dangerous these men might be, or what they were capable of doing when they felt cornered. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where Danny was sitting, and hoped that the boy was safe in his first-class seat. Whatever was about to happen when they landed in Denver, Rebecca knew that her decision to help a scared teenager had set in motion a chain of events that was far bigger than she had ever imagined. The plane began its descent toward Denver International Airport, and Rebecca could only hope that they would all make it safely to the ground before these men decided to take more drastic action. The plane touched down at Denver International Airport with a gentle bump, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but calm. Rebecca could see through her small window that there were more vehicles on the tarmac than usual, several black SUVs and what looked like law enforcement personnel waiting near the gate. The two men beside her had grown increasingly agitated during the descent. The bald man was still making quiet phone calls, while the tall man with the beard kept checking his watch and looking toward the front of the plane where Danny was sitting. Their earlier attempts to appear like normal passengers had completely disappeared. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be at the gate momentarily, but we ask for your patience as there will be a slight delay in the deplaning process due to some administrative matters that need to be handled first." Rebecca saw the tall man clench his fists. He turned to his companion and whispered something that made the bald man's face go pale. Both men began gathering their belongings more urgently, checking their pockets and ensuring their phones were secure. The plane pulled up to the gate, and through the windows Rebecca could see uniformed officers taking positions around the aircraft. It was clear that Captain Morrison had contacted federal authorities, and they had taken his concerns seriously enough to mobilize a significant response. "Attention, passengers," came another announcement, this time from Jessica. "We're going to begin deplaning from the front of the aircraft. Please remain seated until your row is called, and have your identification ready for verification." The tall man stood up despite the instruction to remain seated. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "We have rights. You can't just hold us here without cause." "Sir, please take your seat," Jessica's voice came from the front of the cabin. "Everyone will be processed quickly, but we need to follow proper procedures." The man reluctantly sat back down, but Rebecca could see he was calculating something. His eyes darted between the emergency exits, the aisle, and his phone. The bald man grabbed his arm and shook his head slightly, apparently warning him against doing anything rash. The deplaning process began at the front of the aircraft. Rebecca watched as federal agents in plain clothes boarded the plane and spoke quietly with the flight crew. Danny was among the first passengers to be escorted off, and Rebecca felt relieved to see that he was surrounded by what were clearly law enforcement personnel. As more passengers were processed and removed from the plane, the two men became increasingly desperate. The bald man was now openly making phone calls, no longer trying to hide his conversations. "The package is secure," Rebecca heard him say, "but we have a problem. Federal response. Need immediate extraction alternatives." Rebecca's blood ran cold. They were talking about Danny as if he were cargo rather than a human being. When it was finally time for the passengers in the back rows to deplane, two federal agents approached Rebecca's row. They were professional, but clearly alert to potential trouble. "Ma'am," one of the agents said to Rebecca, "we understand you're the passenger who reported suspicious activity. We'd like you to come with us first so we can get your statement." The tall man shot Rebecca a look of pure hatred, and she realized that these men now knew she was the one who had alerted the authorities. As she gathered her belongings and stood up, she hoped she was making the right decision by getting involved in whatever this situation really was. "Gentlemen," the second agent said to the two men, We're going to need you to remain seated for a few more minutes while we sort out some documentation issues. Rebecca was escorted off the plane and into a secure area of the terminal where Danny was waiting with several agents and a woman who appeared to be a victim advocate. When Danny saw Rebecca, his face lit up with relief. "They told me what you did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You probably saved my life." One of the federal agents, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair, approached Rebecca. "Ms. Williams, I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI. We need to hear everything you observed during the flight, but first, I want you to know that your actions today helped us intercept what we believe was a kidnapping attempt." "Kidnapping?" Rebecca asked, though part of her had suspected something like that. Agent Martinez nodded. Danny's father, Carlos Rodriguez, was a software engineer who discovered that his company was being used to launder money for a criminal organization. Before he was killed, and yes, it was murder, not an accident, he managed to copy financial records and communication logs that could bring down the entire network. Danny looked stricken. "My dad was murdered?" "I'm afraid so," Agent Martinez said gently. "Your father was very brave. He knew he was in danger, but he made sure to get the evidence to you before they could stop him." "What's on the drives he gave me?" Danny asked. "Bank records, encrypted communications, financial transactions. Everything we need to prosecute not just the people who killed your father, but the entire criminal enterprise they were working for. Your father spent months documenting their activities." Rebecca looked at Danny with new respect. This teenager had been carrying evidence that could topple a criminal organization, and he'd been brave enough to keep it safe even when he was being hunted. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "The 2 men from the plane are being arrested," Agent Martinez explained. "We've been tracking this organization for over a year, but we never had solid evidence until now. Danny's father gave us the missing pieces we needed." "What about my aunt in Seattle?" Danny asked. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. In fact, she's been working with us. Your father contacted her before he died and told her to expect you. She's the one who alerted us when your original flight was delayed and you had to connect through Phoenix instead of flying direct." Rebecca felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So when Danny noticed those men following him in Phoenix, they were trying to intercept him before he could reach Seattle and turn over the evidence, Agent Martinez confirmed. "Your decision to switch seats with him disrupted their plan and gave us time to respond." Danny turned to Rebecca with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. You didn't even know me, but you believed me when I was scared." Rebecca smiled and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts about people. And my instincts told me you were a good kid who needed help." Agent Martinez added, "We'll need both of you to provide detailed statements. But I want you to know that because of your actions today, we've been able to arrest not just the 2 men on the plane, but several other members of this criminal network. The evidence Danny was carrying led us to bank accounts in 3 different countries. 3 months later, Rebecca received a package at her office. Inside was a handwritten letter from Danny, along with a newspaper clipping about the criminal organization that had been dismantled thanks to the evidence his father had gathered. "Dear Rebecca," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that I'm doing well living with my Aunt Maria in Seattle. The trial is going well, and the prosecutors say that my dad's evidence is going to put a lot of bad people in prison for a very long time. I start college next fall, and I'm going to study computer science like my dad. I want to use technology to help people just like he did. I'll never forget what you did for me on that plane. My dad always said that the most important journeys aren't about where you're going, but about who you choose to help along the way. Thank you for choosing to help me. Your friend Danny." Rebecca kept the letter framed on her office wall as a reminder that success in business wasn't just about profits and deals. Sometimes the most important decisions you make happen at 30,000 feet. When a scared teenager needs someone to believe in him and stand up for what's right. The criminal organization that had killed Danny's father was eventually convicted on dozens of charges, and the evidence Carlos Rodriguez had gathered helped authorities recover millions of dollars that had been stolen from victims around the world. Danny grew up to become a cybersecurity expert, dedicating his career to fighting the same kind of criminals who had taken his father's life. And Rebecca learned that sometimes the best business decisions have nothing to do with money at all.